What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this past week we got the much anticipated sequel, Senua Saga Hellblade 2, and of course, since I'm making this video, I've played it and I want to talk about it, so without further ado, let's rock. This new game, of course, is a sequel to the first Hellblade game that came out in 2017. The first game is available on Xbox Game Pass. If you have that service and haven't played it yet, I would suggest checking the first game out because it's great before you play the second one. It is a very touching story about mental illness and grief wrapped in this awesome action-adventure Viking package. Therefore, I was super excited when they announced the sequel at the 2019 Game Awards. Not only was this exciting for Hellblade fans like myself, but this game was also kind of used as a showcase of what the upcoming Xbox Series X and S were capable of. The game looked breathtaking and I couldn't wait to get my hands on it. Unfortunately, we did have to wait nearly 5 years since that first announcement and 4 years after the release of the Xbox Series S and X before Senua Saga was released on May 21st, 2024. It, of course, was developed by Ninja Theory, the studio behind Heavenly Sword and DMC, and of course, the first Hellblade game as well. It was published by Xbox Game Studios, therefore it was only available on PC and Xbox Series S and X. I played it day one on Game Pass on my Xbox Series S. Following the events of the first Hellblade, Senua is purposely captured by slavers in order to get close enough to the slave master to kill him so she can free her people. However, during the course of making her way to the slave master, she realizes there is a much larger threat. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through my whole thing with sequels, all my expectations going into a sequel. I just talked about that when I discussed Hades 2. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, check out that video. But basically, in a nutshell, I want a sequel to give me more of the first game and kind of build on it where they can. Unfortunately, Hellblade 2 kind of went a completely different route outside of some of the story beats from the first game and some of the combat. Ninja Theory kind of tossed out most of the first game, which was disappointing to say the least because I really enjoyed that first game. And maybe this has a lot to do with my expectations. The first game is fantastic and I really connected on a personal level with that game. But critically, I knew that there was some room for improvement for sure. I just think I expected them to make this game larger in scale. Ninja Theory had a bigger team, a bigger budget, and better hardware to work with the sequel. In some areas, the sequel actually felt like a step backward from the first game. It unfortunately reminded me of a game like Callisto Protocol that I talked about, I think it was either last year or the year before, which is a fine game, but they obviously spent most of their time and budget making that game, Callisto Protocol, look as beautiful as they could. They didn't have as much time or money to kind of fill out the rest of the aspects of the game. And Senua Saga, unfortunately, feels a lot like that. Like they wanted to make the best looking game they could and paid little attention to the rest. And I think most of that starts with the story. Like I said earlier, I definitely connected with the first game on a very personal level. And to be honest with you, I didn't really expect to have the same connection to the story of the sequel. I just happened to play the first game at a time in my life where I was kind of getting over a loss of a family member. So yes, the first game is about mental illness, but it's also about somebody trying to getting over the grief of losing a loved one. So I obviously connected with that game on a personal level that I didn't expect to connect with the second one. But Ninja Theory certainly didn't do themselves any favors by kind of moving towards a more straightforward action adventure story than a personal character driven story like the first game. Senua's Sacrifice very much feels like Senua's story. This game, however, feels much more like a group dynamic. There are more characters than just Senua in this game. Every chapter you kind of come across a new character, a new what I would call like sidekick kind of joins your adventure as you seek out to kill these giants. But unfortunately, the character development of those sidekicks leaves much to be desired. There's literally a moment towards the end of the game where you're lost in this forest and you get removed from the rest of the group. And there's even a moment where the voices in your head kind of lead you to believe that for like a second, you think that you're going to have to choose one character over another. And for me, some games, if you do a really good job of building out these side characters, those types of choices can be heartbreaking. It's a really, really tough choice to choose one character over another. But in this game, because I didn't really feel like the game did a great job of developing these side characters, I didn't really care which one I chose. I just chose the one that was in front of me at the time. So it didn't really make a whole lot of difference. And there's even a character that plays a huge role in that final reveal, in that final giant fight. Unfortunately, because I didn't feel connected with any of these characters, that big reveal at the end just fell flat for me. I do want to point out that once you beat the game for the first time, it does unlock the option to use the other characters as your narrator, which allows you to kind of get a better feel for those characters and kind of hear their side of the story. Now, I didn't completely play through this game a second time using that option. I did just kind of select that option and then play the first chapter with the new characters as the narrators. So that was interesting. It's a really cool touch, but I would have loved for them to give me that character development in the first playthrough instead of having to wait to unlock the new narrators in the second or third playthrough. And the gameplay is also a bit disappointing as well. This game is very much on rails. There is very little exploring outside of a few extra collectibles from the first game that do pop up in this game as well. It doesn't feel like there's as much of those collectibles in the sequel versus the first game, but outside of that, there's almost little exploring. This game definitely kind of falls into that meme of, yeah, you can climb over cliffs and jump over this and duck under this huge log, but yet you'll come across a patch of weeds that block your path. It definitely leans into that meme a lot in this game. There's also these like spots of what looks like white paint that shows you what can be climbed over and what can be ducked under and what can be interacted with. Like example, there are moments where you'll have to like pull a 2x4 from a section of a wall or whatever to kind of make your way through. It is very clear by the white paint what you can interact with and what route the game wants you to take. There's also the voices in your head, which we'll get to later, but they also kind of tell you without flat out telling you where you're supposed to go. A lot of times they'll give you a lot of hints. They'll speak up a lot of times when you get close to solving a puzzle or when you're kind of on the right track. A lot of times they'll give you a lot of hints. They don't completely tell you how to do things or which way to go, but they do, if you're paying attention, do kind of give you a lot of hints. And it does feel like there's long stretches of this game where you're just kind of holding down the joystick to keep Senua moving. It doesn't feel like you're actively participating in the game. It kind of feels like you're a bystander. And it kind of goes without saying that because of those things, this game does kind of move at a very slow pace, especially early on. There is a lot of walking. And normally that doesn't necessarily bother me, especially in a game like this that looks as good as it does. It kind of gives me an opportunity to take in my surroundings, which I definitely like. One of my favorite games from a few years ago was Death Stranding. And I know a major complaint of people that didn't like that game was that game was just kind of a walking sim. And it definitely could be at times. I did like that game a lot, but I can't admit that it was a bit of a walking sim at times. And I will say that if you didn't like all the walking in Death Stranding, you're definitely not going to like it in Senua's Sacrifice. And I actually think that you can defend the walking in Death Stranding because it's at least a 30+ hour video game. I think the first time I played it, I clocked 90-ish hours. I did a ton of side stuff and I did kind of explore a lot in that game. So therefore, because that game is so long, it didn't feel like walking was as big of a chunk of that game because there was so much other stuff to do. Senua Saga, on the other hand, will only take you less than about 7 hours. So obviously it's a lot shorter, which is fine, but a good chunk of that is just walking. And I am not one to complain about a playtime in a video game. I think it really depends on the game itself. One of my favorite games of all time is Resident Evil Village, and you can easily beat that game for the first time in about 8 hours or so, depending on your skill. I've played it so many times that I'm closer to 2.5 hours, but that game still feels like a full game. Senua Saga, on the other hand, does feel a bit rushed. For example, when you find out that there's these giants terrorizing villages, you being the hero that you are, you kind of make it your mission to stop these giants. And the first giant, you spend I would say about an hour or so going through this cave system to find a way to kill that giant. Side note, if you like the film The Descent, which you should because it's one of the best horror films ever made, you will love the cave system of this game. But once you're finished with that giant, there are 2 more. And I thought to myself, because I play so many video games, I was like, oh, so here's the pattern of the game. We're just gonna do that 2 more times. Yes and no. Yes, you do kind of go through that same process as the first giant, but the next 2 are very short. I think it took me almost as long to get through the cave of the first giant than it did to defeat the other 2 combined. Like the first game, there are puzzles in Hellblade 2, and I will have to admit, as much as I did dig the first game, I did grow tired of these shape puzzles in the first game. If you've played the first game, you know that there are points in that game where your path will be blocked and you kind of have to search the environment to find these shapes. And those can be fun for a little bit, but I do think that they get a little overused in the first game. And I was sad to see those types of puzzles make a return in the sequel. However, they didn't feel like they were as big of a part of this game like they were in the original. And this game did switch it up with some more visual platforming puzzles. Now, it has been a minute since I played the first game, so I'm not sure how these platforming puzzles stack up to the original, but the visual platforming puzzles in the sequel did feel crazy easy. If you've ever played a platformer like Senua Saga, you're going to catch on to these puzzles very easily. I've played a lot of those types of games. I've talked about before in past reviews that platformers are my favorite genre, so I caught on to these puzzles very, very quickly. The combat is also relatively the same from the first game. If you played a few Soulsborne games, you will definitely see the influence in the combat system. The combat system in Senua Saga is definitely based on timing. You have to be very cautious. You have to pick your spots when to block, dodge, and strike. If you go into combat expecting to kind of hack and slash your way through this game, you are not going to get very far. There is a parry system like the first game, but the timing in the sequel is very short, so I found myself mostly blocking and dodging and kind of ignoring the parry system. And to be honest, when I was writing this review, I was a little hesitant to even bring up Soulsborne games, because while I do think Ninja Theory used those games as an influence, more in the first game than necessarily in its sequel, there is kind of that understanding that if you bring up Soulsborne, you mean the game is really, really hard. And the combat, much like the first game, is crazy easy in Senua Saga. Even if you've never played a game like this before, you will pick up the combat pretty easily. And I don't necessarily mean the combat is boring. I do think that there are plenty of different enemy types that does keep the combat fresh. There are enemies that will spit fire at you. There's other enemies that will throw projectiles at you. That does kind of keep the combat fresh. You can also use your focus to help you occasionally in battle as well. It helps you freeze time, and then you can kind of go just crazy on whoever you're fighting. But the biggest change from the first game as far as the combat is concerned is the combat is one-on-one. The first game felt more like a God of War, where you're taking on all of these enemies at once, and you kind of have to juggle each enemy. In this game, however, every combat situation, yes, there'll be a bunch of enemies, but you only take them on one at a time. And it makes it feel not only easier, but it also feels like Ninja Theory did that so they could make the combat feel much more cinematic. They blend the combat with some really cool cutscene transitions that look amazing. Being the video game nerd I am, I was constantly in awe in the craftsmanship of how they made this game look as stunning as it was. I especially like this big battle around the third act where you do fight alongside your buddies that you've kind of been collecting as the game has gone along. And it's super cinematic. You will literally take on enemies one-on-one, but once you finish one enemy, one of your buddies will pop in and save you from being attacked by another. It's very cinematic and very cool. It was easily my favorite moment from this game. It was just awesome. I did love the combat. I just wish there was a little bit more, and maybe that was one of the reasons, not to give myself an excuse, but maybe that was the reason why I struggled with the parry timing so much, was because there was long stretches in between combat in this game, and I thought it was awesome. I liked the cinematic nature of the combat. I just wish that there was more of it. And I know I've already mentioned Callisto Protocol once in this review, but I mentioned when I reviewed that game that up until that point, it was probably the most beautiful game as far as the fidelity of the cutscenes were concerned. Senua Saga has taken that crown from Callisto Protocol. It is literally the most graphically beautiful game I have ever played. Now, I know some people will complain that it is locked at 30 frames per second on console. I've talked about before on past reviews that I'm not an FPS guy. I don't really care about frames per second as long as the game looks good, and this game looks amazing. You spent a majority of this game outside kind of walking around, and the way that they crafted the environment, the way that the sunlight shines through the trees and mountains really blew me away. They did lean into the lens flare a bit more for my taste, but that's a minor nitpick. I thought the lighting was done beautifully in this game. Senua Saga would also do this really interesting thing where they would transition between one chapter to another. They would kind of pan over the horizon and kind of give you this beautiful wide shot of the environment and then kind of slowly zoom into the characters walking. It was beautiful. It reminded me a lot of Fellowship of the Ring, which that's one of my favorite movies in one of my favorite franchises. So I was obviously a big fan of that. Senua Saga also has a great photo mode. I'm not a huge photo mode guy, but if that's your thing, you will really dig this game. And all in all, and I can't imagine I'm the only person that used to do this as a kid, I would watch these video game trailers and I would just think, man, I wish that the actual game would look that good. And I thought the exact same thing when I first saw that Game Awards announcement for this game. I was like, man, that looks amazing. There's no way the game's gonna look that good. Well, I am pleased to announce that Senua Saga is that game that I dreamed about as a kid, that finally looks as good as its trailer. And some of that credit, of course, has to go to the performances. Of course, Ninja Theory has been killing it for years in performance capture. They did it with one of my favorite actors of all time, Andy Serkis, in Heavenly Blade, and they really stepped up their game in Senua Saga. The whole cast did a great job with the performance capture, but of course, credit has to go mainly to the talented actress Melina Juergens. This is Senua's game. Despite having a lot of side characters in this game, it's still her game for sure, and Juergens absolutely carries the game with her performance. She won a lot of awards for her performance as Senua in the first Hellblade, and I would be shocked if she wasn't the favorite for all of those awards this year as well. And I know I'm not breaking any new ground when I say this. The game literally tells you this when you first fire it up, but you should be playing this game with headphones. You literally have those voices in your head like the first game. And the way that they use this 3D sound, it really feels like the voices are in your head as well, which is a very cool touch, which is the main reason why you should be playing this with headphones. But it certainly doesn't hurt that the music, in my opinion, is just as good as the sound design with the voices in your head. I think they absolutely killed it with the sound design in this game, much like the first game. Wrapping this review up, while Senua Saga wasn't everything I wanted it to be, yes, the gameplay leaves much to be desired. I still do think it's worth your time just for the visuals, sound design, and performances alone. Like I said earlier, it is one of the most beautiful games I've ever played. Plus, it's not too long. Now, that is obviously a negative that I mentioned earlier because it does feel a little rushed, but you can, because it's not very long, easily knock it out in a long afternoon if you want. Therefore, I would definitely still recommend playing this game, especially if you enjoyed the first Hellblade, and especially if you do have Xbox Game Pass, because outside of the price for that subscription service, the barrier to entry for Senua Saga is very low. Therefore, I am going to give it 3.5 stars out of 5, which is a recommendation for me, but not a super strong one at that. But as always, those are just my thoughts on Senua Saga. I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below, especially if you played the first one. I want to hear your thoughts on how you felt like the sequel stacked up to the original. But of course, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button, as the kids say. Also, consider subscribing. If you do subscribe, ding that bell. That way you're notified every time I post another video. I try to post weekly gaming related content, so if you like that content, which you obviously do if you've made it this far in this video, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. But until next video, take it easy. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy, and we were just talking and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?